The stakeout had officially been declared a failure at hour 16. By hour 18, Hannah had stopped caring about the official designation and started caring exclusively about whether her legs would still function when she finally stood up. The unmarked van she'd shared with Detectives Reyes and Polk had pulled out at 11:47 p.m. Regrouping, Reyes called it, which was department language for "we're hungry and nothing is happening." Hannah had stayed. She always stayed. That was her problem. According to every performance review she'd ever received, worded in various diplomatic ways that all meant the same thing. Wright doesn't know when to quit. She knew when to quit. She just chose not to. But by the time the rain upgraded from inconvenient to genuinely hostile, and her radio gave its last dying crackle somewhere around midnight, even Hannah's stubbornness had reached its billing limit. She'd walked 6 blocks in a downpour that didn't distinguish between civilians and law enforcement. Her navy uniform soaked straight through to the skin, her badge throwing back the fractured light of passing cars like it was mocking her. The Blacktown car was right where dispatch had said the extraction vehicle would be. Same block, same curb, same low, patient idle. She didn't look at the plates. She should have looked at the plates. But a person operating on 3 hours of sleep and 16 hours of surveillance doesn't run plates on what their exhausted brain has already categorized as safe. She just pulled open the door, fell into the seat, felt the rain disappear behind the soft click of the latch, and exhaled like she was releasing something she'd been holding for years. She didn't look left. Her eyes closed before the car even began to move. Chu Hyun watched the sleeping police officer with the same unhurried attention he gave to most things that surprised him, which was almost nothing anymore. Surprise was a young man's experience. At 34, having built an empire on the twin foundations of patience and precise intelligence, Chu found the world largely predictable. People wanted money, power, or protection. They moved in patterns. They telegraphed their intentions with their eyes. This one had climbed into his car and immediately gone unconscious. He looked at the wanted poster in his hand. His own face looked back at him, slightly blurred from the 3rd or 4th generation photocopy, the way bureaucracies always degraded images over time. Kim. Syndicate. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. He'd had it on his desk for a week, retrieved from a source embedded in the 12th precinct. He'd been reading it when she got in. The silver badge on her chest caught the light as the car moved through an intersection. Her head had drifted sideways against the quilted leather, her bun slightly undone on one side, a single dark strand curved against her cheek. Her hands were loose in her lap. Every bit of the authority and tension she'd carried through that door had simply released. Like a fist, finally opening. Her department lanyard had slipped free from her collar and lay curled against the seat beside her. He found it unexpectedly difficult to look away. "Sir." His driver's voice came low through the partition. "Instructions?" Chu glanced at the badge number on her uniform. Glanced at the address his sources had already cross-referenced with that badge number, because that was the kind of organization he ran thorough, always, as a matter of survival. "Riverside and 4th, he said quietly. "The Callaway building. Don't wake her." He looked back at the poster. Then, at the woman, sleeping 3 inches from his shoulder, with the complete, unguarded trust of someone who had no idea what she'd walked into. He folded the wanted poster once, precisely along its center crease, and held it loosely between 2 fingers, while the city slid past in watercolor streaks of red and gold. Outside, the rain kept hammering. Inside, for reasons Chu Hyun did not immediately examine, the car felt unusually still. She woke up on her own couch. That was the first wrong thing. Hannah sat up fast, the way cops wake up all at once, no transition, hand moving toward her hip before she'd fully processed consciousness. Her apartment, her couch, her lamp on the side table, throwing the same amber light it always threw at. She checked her watch. 3:17 She'd been on a stakeout. Her radio died. She'd gotten into the extraction vehicle and her hand found her duty belt. Not her hip holster, Her duty belt, where her radio should have been clipped, where her cuffs rode on the left side, where there was now something that hadn't been there before. A piece of paper, folded once, tucked into the belt loop beside her radio mount, with deliberate, almost careful precision. She pulled it out, unfolded it. The fluorescent buzz of her kitchen light felt suddenly very loud. Wanted. Chu Hyun, Kim syndicate. Considered armed and extremely dangerous. She looked at the photo. She'd looked at this photo approximately 400 times in the past 4 months, pinned above her desk, projected in briefings, printed on the inside cover of the task force binder she kept in her locker. She knew this face. Sharp jaw, dark hair. Eyes that the photographer had caught in a rare moment of direct attention, looking straight into the lens like the camera was the one being assessed. She'd fallen asleep next to that face. She stood up so fast the blood left her head, and she had to grab the lamp to stay upright. She crossed to her window and looked down at the street. Empty. Rain-slicked pavement. A taxi crawling through the intersection. Nothing. No black town car. No indication that the city's most wanted crime lord had, apparently, tucked her in and left. Hannah stood at that window for a long time. Then she turned around, sat back down on the couch, and looked at the poster in her hands with the focused, unblinking stillness of a woman who had just had her entire understanding of a situation rearranged without her consent. He'd had her, completely, asleep, unarmed effectively. She never would have drawn fast enough from dead sleep, and wearing a badge that represented every legal threat he faced in this city. He could have had her killed before the car reached the end of the block. He could have used her as leverage. He could have taken her weapon, her badge, her radio, and every piece of intelligence she might carry. Instead, he'd brought her home and left her a souvenir. She looked at his eyes in the photo. Why? She was back at her desk the next morning, before anyone else arrived, her off-the-books investigation file open beside the official task force binder, which she now read with an entirely different set of questions. Not where is Chu Hyun, but what does he know that I don't? 3 days later, she was writing a parking citation on Merchant Street when a black car, not a town car this time, something lower and quieter, rolled to a stop at the curb, 20 feet ahead. The window came down. He looked exactly like his photo. Worse, actually. The photo hadn't accounted for the way he sat, like the car had been built around him specifically. Like he had never in his life occupied a space that didn't immediately reconfigure to accommodate him. The suit jacket was charcoal this time. The shirt beneath it was still white. Still unbuttoned at the collar. He was looking directly at her. Hannah's hand moved to her radio before she'd made a conscious decision. Dead habit. The radio that now had a fresh battery in it, because she had learned from that mistake. Officer Wright. His voice was quiet and even, accented in a way that smoothed the edges off certain consonants. You look better rested. Step out of the vehicle, she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Something moved in his eyes that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite respect, and was possibly both. I have somewhere to be, but I wanted to return something. He extended one hand out the window. Her department-issued lanyard, the one she hadn't even noticed was missing, dangled from one finger. You left it in my car. She walked toward him slowly, the way you approached anything that might move suddenly. She took the lanyard without breaking eye contact. You're going to want to stay very still while I... Your captain, he said. And the 2 words landed differently than anything else he might have said, because his tone shifted barely, just a fraction. Just enough for someone paying close attention to notice. Had dinner last Thursday with a man named Feo Salazar. Private room. Portsmouth restaurant, on 61st. I thought you might find that interesting. He held her gaze for exactly 2 more seconds. Then the window went up. The car pulled away from the curb, smooth and unhurried, like a thought you couldn't quite catch. Hannah stood on the sidewalk with her lanyard in her hand. Feo Salazar. She knew that name. It was in a separate file entirely. DEA file, not NYPD. Mid-level cartel operator with aspirations above his station and a known hatred for the Kim syndicate's territorial holdings on the east side. The kind of man who didn't have dinner with police captains by accident. She looked at the end of the block where the car had turned. She went back to her patrol and said nothing to anyone. But that night, alone in her apartment, with her laptop and a department database login that her captain didn't know she still had access to, she started pulling threads. He made it a kind of art after that. A coffee shop on Delaney. She was questioning a witness. He was at the far end of the counter, reading something on his phone. He didn't look up. But when she passed his table on her way out, there was a napkin folded beside his cup, with a date, a location, and the word Thursday, written in clean, precise print. She pocketed it like evidence. Because that's what it was. A parking structure on West 44th. She was following a lead on a different case entirely, when she heard footsteps behind her that were too deliberate to be random. She turned with her hand on her holster to find him 3 car lengths back, hands in his jacket pockets, looking at her with that expression she was beginning to be able to read. Not amusement exactly, interest, the way a person looks when something is happening that they hadn't fully anticipated. "You're following me," she said. "You're in my parking structure," he replied. "I could arrest you right now." "You could try." He said it without heat, without arrogance, just as a statement of fact that they both understood the same way. "But you came here alone, which means you didn't file a report on any of our previous conversations, which means you're already working something off book." He tilted his head slightly. "What did you find on Salazar?" She hated how fast her silence answered for her. "There's more," he said. "There's always more, with men like your captain, but you need to be inside the right room to see it." He reached into his jacket, she tensed, and produced a small card, which he set on the hood of the nearest car rather than handing to her directly, like he understood the particular rules of what she could and couldn't accept. Friday. The address on the back. Come alone, or don't come. He walked to the elevator and pressed the button, and stood with his back to her, jacket falling perfectly from his shoulders, unhurried, like a man who had already decided how this was going to go. She picked up the card. She told herself she was going to run it for prints. She went on Friday. The address was a rooftop, overlooking the 12th precinct. She stood beside him at the railing, 6 feet of careful distance between them. The city spread below like a circuit board with the lights on, and watched through the telephoto lens he'd already set up on a tripod. A gesture that managed to be both an offering and an indictment simultaneously. At 9:43 p.m., her captain's unmarked car pulled into the private lot behind the building. At 9:51, a second vehicle arrived, dark, no plates. 2 men she didn't recognize and 1 she did. Feo Salazar, shorter in person than she'd imagined, jacket that cost more than her monthly salary. They went inside. She filmed it all on her personal phone, which Chu had quietly suggested she switch to 20 minutes ago, in a sentence so casual she hadn't registered its weight until just now. "How long?" she said. "Long enough that the infrastructure is solid." He wasn't looking through the lens. He was looking at the building with his hands in his pockets, and his voice was level, in the way that things are level when they've been deliberately made that way. "Your task force was built to hunt me, but the warrants, the surveillance approvals, the evidence that keeps disappearing before trial, that isn't incompetence, Officer Wright. That is management." She lowered her phone. The recording was still running. "They're using the department to clear territory," she said. Not a question. The shape of it had been assembling itself in her mind for 2 weeks, and now the last piece had just locked into place, with the quiet, terrible click of something becoming undeniable. "Salazar's operation moves into every block your syndicate vacates. And your syndicate keeps vacating blocks because my precinct keeps building cases against you, while building no cases at all against Salazar. He looked at her then, for the first time since they'd arrived. Steady, direct. Yes. She stared at the building where her captain was, currently having a meeting with a cartel operator, and felt something shift in her chest. Some foundational thing she'd been standing on for 7 years, tilting. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "Because you're the only person in that building," he said, "who is actually trying to do what the badge says." She looked back at the precinct. Her precinct. The place she'd given the last 7 years to. The institution she'd defended in arguments and navigated around biases for, and believed in, stubbornly, past every piece of evidence that she probably shouldn't. She saved the video. She sent it to an encrypted folder. She started building her case. There was one number she hadn't used yet, an FBI field contact she'd kept quietly in her phone for 2 years. The kind of insurance a smart cop takes out when she works in a building she isn't entirely sure she trusts. She had it ready by the following Wednesday. 48 hours of compiled evidence, the rooftop footage, the database pulls, 3 cross-referenced financial threads that connected a shell company to both Salazar's known operations and a private account belonging to a shell LLC registered to a name that was one step removed. From her captain's brother-in-law. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't trial-ready, but it was enough for internal affairs to open a formal investigation, and once that door opened, it would be very hard to close. She moved fast and she moved careful, pulling records in short sessions, never from the same terminal twice. The way you work when you know someone might be watching. She was going to walk it in Thursday morning. On Wednesday night, her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered it because she answered everything now, because everything felt like it could be the thing that mattered. Right. A voice she didn't recognize. Male, unhurried. "The captain knows you've been pulling files. He's been watching your login activity for 10 days. A pause. "Tonight, they're going to move the body of an informant named Marcus Teal, who was found dead this morning, to your apartment building's basement storage unit. The one registered in your name." The line went dead. She was already on her feet, coat half on, mind running the geometry of it. How fast? Which route? Whether she could get there first? Whether it was already too late? Whether this was a trap designed to get her moving? So they could. Her door came in at 12:04 a.m. Not a knock. The door. 4 officers she recognized from her own precinct, and one she didn't. Tactical vests, weapons drawn, voices overlapping in the particular controlled chaos of a raid that had been choreographed in advance. They had a warrant. They had her name on it. They had a photograph somehow, already. In the 12 hours since Marcus Teal had apparently died of her, at a location she could place herself at 3 weeks ago, for entirely legitimate reasons. Standing close enough to the informant to look deliberate, in the right kind of light. She didn't run. She stood in the middle of her apartment with her hands visible and her mind absolutely white and calm in the way that extreme crisis sometimes produces, like a storm that clears everything. "Hannah Wright," the officer at the front said, "you are under arrest for the murder of—" "I know whose name is on the warrant," she said. She let them put on the cuffs. She answered nothing during processing. She said 3 words to the one officer in the building. She still halfway trusted, checked the storage unit, and watched his face go carefully blank in a way that told her he already knew something was wrong, even if he wouldn't be able to act on it. They gave her one phone call at 2:30 a.m. She didn't call a lawyer. She stood in the holding area with the receiver in her hand and looked at the number she'd memorized 3 days ago. The one from the card on the parking structure, car hood, the one she'd told herself she was only keeping as evidence, and understood that she had run completely out of road. She dialed. It rang once. "I wondered," Chu Hyun said, and his voice was exactly as unhurried as it always was. how long it would take. They framed me, she said. I know. No surprise. No, I told you so, which she noted and filed. Are you still inside? For about 6 more hours before they move me to county. Then you have time, he said. When they release you on processing, walk east on Delaney. Don't go home. Don't contact your precinct. Don't contact anyone from your unit. A pause. Can you do that? She looked through the reinforced glass at the bullpen of her own police department, the building she had walked into every morning for 7 years, the people whose names she knew, whose coffee orders she knew, whose children's names she knew, and felt the last of that foundational thing she'd been standing on give way beneath her. Yeah, she said, I can do that. They processed her out at 6:18 a.m. on a technical irregularity. Her union rep had filed an emergency hold on the warrant, buying her a narrow window before the captain could reissue through a friendlier judge. She had maybe 4 hours before that window closed. Maybe less. She walked east on Delaney. The city was doing its early morning thing. Delivery trucks, coffee carts, the particular population of people who exist before 7 a.m. and belong to a different version of the same place everyone else inhabits later. Hannah moved through it in her civilian clothes they'd let her change, at least with her badge gone, her weapon in evidence lockup, and a warrant with her name on it, aging like milk somewhere in the system behind her. The car found her 2 blocks in. Black, low, quiet engine. It slowed to match her pace, and the rear window came down without drama. Get in, Chu said. She got in. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. The city moved past the tinted windows, and Hannah sat with her hands flat on her thighs, and her jaw set, and her mind sorting through the wreckage of the last 6 hours with the methodical focus of someone who cannot afford to feel things yet, and knows it. Chu sat beside her at his customary 3 inches of distance, looking forward, leaving her to it. How much do you actually know? She finally said. About the captain's operation? Most of it. He said it without apology. I've been building a case of my own for 8 months. Then why haven't you? She stopped, rerouted, because the answer was obvious, and she was smarter than that question. His case would never see a courtroom. His evidence would never be admissible. A crime lord's intelligence file was leverage, not litigation. What do you actually have? A physical ledger. He turned to look at her then, and his eyes in the gray morning light were darker and more direct than she was used to. Salazar keeps paper records of everything, every payment, every arrangement, every name in the department, on his payroll. Old habit from a man who doesn't trust digital trails. The original ledger is in your precinct's secure evidence locker. Your captain had it logged as materials from an unrelated case 18 months ago. It's been sitting there ever since, mislabeled, in plain sight. Hannah stared at him. You've known where it was for 8 months. I've known where it was for 8 months, he confirmed. And you needed me. Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile. I needed someone who could get inside that building without starting a war. He paused. I also needed someone whose name on the evidence chain would actually mean something in a courtroom. She looked at him for a long moment, at the absolute, unruffled composure of him. The way he occupied the world, like it was a chessboard he'd already solved 3 moves ahead. She thought about pointing out that he had been manipulating the situation from the beginning. She thought about the fact that she was currently a fugitive from her own department, and he was the only person who had told her the truth for the past 2 weeks. If I do this, she said, and we get the ledger, I walk it to the FBI field office myself. Not your people, not a back channel. Me, in person. Agreed. And when this is over, I know, he said, not dismissive, something quieter than that. I know what you'll have to do when this is over. The car turned off the main road and began climbing. The penthouse was not what she'd expected, which she recognized was itself a kind of bias she needed to examine. She'd expected something theatrical, the crime lord aesthetic, dark and deliberate, calculated intimidation. What she found instead was a large, spare space with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city, bookshelves that had been genuinely used, and an absence of clutter so complete it felt less like wealth and more like discipline. Like a man who'd cut away everything that didn't matter until only the essential remained. His people moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of professionals who'd learned long ago that noise was a liability. Two of them clocked her bad-shaped absence immediately and adjusted their behavior in ways that were subtle enough to be professional and obvious enough to be a message. She filed it away. Chu showed her the room she'd be using, which was clean and had a window that faced east, and then he showed her the room she'd actually be living in for the foreseeable future. A large workspace that had been converted into a situation room. Maps and photographs and printed documents arranged across 3 long tables with the logic of a mind that organized information the way she did. By connection, not category. She stood at the center of it and turned slowly. "You built this for the captain," she said. "I built this for the problem." He moved to the far table and turned one of the documents toward her. "We have 4 days before your warrant gets reissued by a federal judge, which is when your captain plans to escalate. His arrangement with Salazar has a deadline. There's a territory transfer scheduled for the end of the month. He needs you gone before then, and he needs me gone before then, and he is very much aware at this point that those 2 problems have started moving in the same direction." Hannah looked at the map of the precinct floor plan spread across the center table. The evidence locker was marked in red. 3 access points, 2 of which required keycards she no longer had, and one of which was a loading dock with a guard rotation she used to know by heart. "I know that building," she said. "I know you do. My keycard was taken when they processed me." "I have a copy of your keycard," he said, and at her expression he added, simply, "I make copies of things." She decided not to ask when. The locker is on the 2nd sublevel. Security cameras on a 12-minute rotation. There's a desk officer who does a physical walk at the top of every hour. Karev. He's been on that assignment for 3 years. He's thorough. She was already moving to the table, already reading the floor plan the way her body read it, with the instinct of someone who'd walked those corridors in a previous life. The mislabeled evidence would be in the West Wing cold storage. That section was reorganized 18 months ago. She looked up. He was watching her with that expression she'd cataloged by now, the one that was almost impossible to read, because it was entirely genuine. Which was somehow more disarming than everything else about him. "Stop looking at me like that," she said. "Like what?" She didn't answer and went back to the map. They worked. That was what the first 2 days were. Stripped of everything else. Just 2 very different, very capable people, in a room full of information, building a plan out of the available materials. They had arguments that were actually productive, which Hannah hadn't experienced in years. He pushed back on her instincts when they were sentimental. She pushed back on his when they were ruthless. They found, in the friction, something that worked better than either approach alone. On the 3rd night, she was sitting on the floor of the workspace. She thought, better on the floor, always had with photographs spread around her, a cold cup of coffee in her hand, and the specific kind of exhaustion that comes from too many hours of concentration rather than too many hours of physical effort. Chu had been quiet for an hour, working at the far table, and she'd almost forgotten he was there. In the way, you forget about things that have become natural. "How long have you been running?" she asked. She hadn't planned to ask it. He didn't look up immediately. "Which version of that question are you asking?" "Both, I guess." He set down what he was reading. The city lights behind him through the glass were the usual blur of gold and white, distant and constant. "My father built the syndicate. I inherited it at 22 when he died. I've been managing it since then." A pause. "Running from the specific problem of your department. 8 months, as I said. You didn't have to stay in the city." "No," But you did. He looked at her with something that was patient and a little complicated. This is my city. I was born 4 miles from where we're sitting. My father's grave is 6 miles north. He said it without drama, just as fact. Men like your captain don't get to take things that aren't theirs. She thought about that. She thought about the 7 years she'd given to an institution that had been quietly working against everything she believed it stood for. And she thought about what it meant to stay somewhere that had stopped deserving your loyalty, and to stay anyway, because you were too stubborn to let it go. I thought the law was the thing that held everything together, she said. Not the specific laws, the idea that there was a system and it was imperfect, but if you worked inside it and pushed hard enough from the right angle, it would eventually produce something like justice. He was quiet. I still think that, she said. Mostly. In the version where the system isn't being run by someone like the captain. The system is always being run by someone, he said. The only question is whether that person has decided the system is a tool or a principle. She looked at him across the room, full of evidence of her former captain's corruption. What do you think it is? I think it's whatever the person holding it decides it is. He held her gaze. Which is why the person matters. She didn't look away. The room was very quiet in the way rooms get late at night, when the city outside has finally settled into its lower frequencies. She was aware of the specific quality of the silence between them, the way it had changed over 3 days, from careful to something else, something with more weight in it. You should have woken me up, she said quietly. In the car, that first night. I know. Why didn't you? He was still for a moment. Then, with the deliberateness of a man who doesn't say things carelessly, because you looked like someone who hadn't been safe in a very long time. The words landed somewhere deep and did something she hadn't been prepared for. She felt the back of her throat tighten, with the kind of emotion that emerges, specifically when someone names a thing you didn't know you needed named. She looked down at the photographs in her lap. She looked back up. She didn't remember deciding to move. But she crossed the room, and he turned to face her fully, and the 3 inches of careful distance they had maintained for weeks, closed without ceremony and without regret, and whatever remained of the careful, professional distance between a cop and a criminal dissolved into something neither of them had planned. And both of them had been moving toward since a rainy night, and a wrong car door, and a wanted poster, folded into a duty belt. Outside, the city kept its lights on, indifferent and constant. Thursday came with a gray, overcast morning, and the particular quiet of people who have made a decision and are done second-guessing it. They went in at 2 a.m. 2 of Chu's people positioned at the loading dock approach for extraction, only his explicit instruction, and her explicit condition. Nobody from his organization entered the building. This was her house, her risk, her rules of engagement. He'd agreed without argument, which she was still faintly surprised by. The loading dock guard rotation was exactly as she'd remembered. 12 minutes felt different from inside it, compressed and elastic at the same time, each second occupying a different amount of space, depending on what was happening within it. Chu moved beside her with a silence that was not the trained silence of a cop working a building, but something older and more innate, the quietness of a man who had learned very young that sound was information, and information was survival. Her copied keycard worked on the sub-level door. Her hands were steady. She noted this with something that wasn't quite pride and wasn't quite relief. The West Wing cold storage smelled like every evidence locker she'd ever worked, chemical preservation and old paper, and the particular staleness of things removed from context. The filing system was standardized, and she knew it, which was the advantage they'd built the entire plan around. Case number, date, category. The mislabeled ledger had been filed under a property crime from 18 months ago, second shelf from the bottom on the north wall, because whoever had filed it had simply wanted it unremarkable. She found it in 40 seconds. Black cover, binder clipped, corners worn from handling, She opened it to a random page, and the column entries were exactly what Chu had described. Dates, amounts, names in an abbreviated code. She could already begin to parse, because she'd spent 4 days studying Salazar's organizational language from the documents in the Situation Room. She looked at Chu. He looked at the ledger. His expression was the closest thing to relief she'd seen on his face, which on him registered as a very slight easing around the eyes. She put it in the bag. The alarm did not come from the camera rotation, which they'd timed. It came from the door sensor, on the cold storage unit itself, a sensor that had been added in a precinct-wide security upgrade 8 weeks ago, which neither of them had known about, because it hadn't been in any documentation available outside the department. The sound was not loud. It didn't need to be. "Go," Chu said, and they were moving before the echo finished. The 12 minutes collapsed into something urgent and geometric. Which door? Which corner? Which stairwell? The loading dock or the secondary exit? 2 corridors east. She made the call for the secondary exit because the loading dock was where they'd expect departure, and she was still, despite everything, a cop who understood how cops think. They hit the stairwell door at the same moment. The sub-level lights came fully on, flooded white and institutional, and the sound of boots above them meant the response time was faster than it should have been, which meant someone had been watching, waiting, which meant, "He knew we were coming," she said, on the stairs, still moving. "Yes," Chu said, 2 steps behind her, his voice doing nothing unusual even at a run. "He's known since yesterday. I suspected this morning. And you didn't. Tell you? You would have stopped." He said it without apology. "We needed the ledger." She wanted to be angry about that. She filed it for later, which was a place she was accumulating a significant number of things. The secondary exit put them into an alley that fed onto a service road, 3 blocks from the precinct perimeter. Chu's people were already reconfiguring extraction. She could hear it in the earpiece. Chu passed her without ceremony, 2 voices running new coordinates in rapid Korean, with the practiced calm of people who'd done this before. They ran. The rain had come back, because of course it had. Because in this story, the rain always came back. They made it 4 blocks before the SUVs cut off both ends of the street. The warehouse on Garfield had been decommissioned for 2 years. Hannah knew it because she'd processed a scene there 18 months ago. A different case. A different life. The captain knew it too, which was presumably why he'd chosen it as a kill box. 6 of his people inside the perimeter when they arrived, Chu's extraction driver already down. And the 2 of them moving through the dark interior with the ledger in Hannah's bag and the geometry of the situation, reducing itself rapidly to something very simple and very bad. "Back corner," she said. "Low. Loading platform. There's a structural beam that gives cover on 2 sides." He followed without question. That was the thing about 3 days of planning. In a room together, you learned how the other person moved, and you stopped having to explain everything. They made the platform. She had Chu's secondary piece, a compact she'd agreed to carry for this specific contingency, and he had his primary, and the expression of a man who had been in worse situations, and was quietly running the math on this one. The captain's voice came from the front of the building, amplified and controlled, the voice of someone who had decided this was the ending and was savoring the shape of it. "Right. I have to say, the Mafia boss was a choice. A pause that was designed to feel leisurely. Bring me the ledger, and I'll make this faster." "He's positioned at the main entrance," Chu said quietly, reading the acoustics. 2 flanking left, 2 right, 1 on the upper catwalk. "I see the catwalk one," she confirmed. She did not look at Chu. She was watching their perimeter and running her own math, and trying not to think about the several ways this ended badly. "When I give you the distraction, the catwalk." "Handled. And then the captain is mine." She said it flatly. "He's mine, Chu." A pause. Agreed. She threw the distraction a piece of debris from the loading platform floor, angled to draw attention left, and the next 40 seconds were the particular chaos of close-quarters violence that no amount of training fully prepares you for, because the body runs on something older and faster than training in those moments. The catwalk figure dropped. She moved right. She took a hit to her shoulder that spun her into the structural beam, not a bullet, a graze. Her brain noted with bizarre clinical detachment and kept moving. The captain was bigger in person than he looked behind a desk. He moved like someone who had not always been behind a desk. He had his weapon on her before she cleared the final approach, and for a specific, suspended moment, they stood 8 feet apart, with their guns on each other, in the dark of an empty warehouse, and everything was very simple. "You're done," she said. "The ledger is documented. I've already sent copies." She hadn't, but he couldn't know that. "You shoot me, you're giving the FBI everything they need. You don't have the authority to." The shot came from the left, not hers. "Choose." And it took the weapon from the captain's hand with surgical precision that shouldn't have been possible at that angle in that darkness, but was. And then Hannah was closing the distance, and the captain was trying to run, and she put him down the way she'd been trained, to put people down efficiently, without sentiment. Every month of blind loyalty she'd spent trusting the wrong people behind it. She got him cuffed with the cuffs she'd borrowed from Chu's situation room 3 days ago. She looked up. Chu was at the support pillar 12 feet behind her. He was upright. He had one hand pressed to his left side, jacket dark with something darker, and his face had the careful blankness of a man managing a significant amount of pain with everything he had. "Chu, I'm standing," he said. "That's the relevant fact." She crossed to him fast. He let her look, which told her more than his words did. He was hurt badly enough that maintaining the composed performance required more effort than he had to spare for argument. The entry wound was high on the left side, below the ribs. She pressed her hand over his, and he let that happen too, without comment. "In the distance, sirens. How many?" she said. "Enough." He was looking at her with that expression, the impossible-to-read genuine one, but there was something different in it now. Something that had given up pretending it was anything other than what it was. "Hannah, don't," she said. "Listen to me." His voice was quiet and even, and underneath it was something that cost him something to say. "The ledger needs a clean chain of custody. It needs your hands, your testimony, your name. My name on that evidence is a defense attorney's gift." He reached into his jacket with the hand that wasn't pressed to his side and produced a zip tie she hadn't known he was carrying. He held it out to her. "One more thing for your hands." She looked at the zip tie. She looked at him. "You planned this part," she said. "I planned for the possibility." His eyes didn't move from hers. "There's a difference." The sirens were louder now. "A minute, maybe less. You took a bullet," she said. "I've had worse. That's not the Chu. You're extraordinary." The corner of his mouth moved. "Even now." "I know." He pressed the zip tie into her hand and closed her fingers around it, and his hand stayed over hers for exactly 1 moment before releasing. "My lawyers are already awake. I have the best lawyers in the city, Hannah. I will be fine." He said it with enough calm that some small part of her, the part still capable of believing things it was told, chose to accept it. She looked at the captain, cuffed on the floor. She looked at the ledger in her bag. She looked at Chu, standing against a pillar in a warehouse, with blood on his jacket, and something that was not amusement and not respect, and was simply and completely her on his face. She cuffed him. He let her. The first officers through the door found a scene that told a very specific story. One corrupt police captain, subdued and restrained, one of the city's most wanted criminals, cuffed and seated against a support pillar. And Officer Hannah Wright, standing in the center of it all, with an evidence ledger in her hand and a graze wound on her shoulder, and an expression that closed down every question before it was asked. She told the story she was given. She told it clearly, in the controlled and precise language of a cop who knows how statements become records. She said she'd been working an off-the-books investigation into precinct corruption after being framed, that she'd secured documentary evidence, that she'd been ambushed, that the situation had been resolved. She answered the questions she was asked and did not elaborate on what she wasn't asked. The FBI was there within 20 minutes because she'd called them from Chu's Situation Room on night 2, using the federal contact she'd quietly kept in her phone for years, the insurance policy she'd taken out for exactly this kind of situation. She'd known, on some level, that the day might come when the precinct was the problem. She did not look at Chu until they were loading him into a separate vehicle, and then she looked, because she couldn't not look. He was handcuffed, his jacket pressed against the wound, 2 officers on either side of him, and he was walking with the same unhurried composure with which he did everything. At the vehicle door he turned, not searching. He already knew where she was, and he looked at her across the distance of the warehouse lot, with the city lights beginning to break through behind him, and the rain finally easing to something gentle. He smiled. Not the small, controlled smirk she'd learned to read over weeks. Something different, something that was for her specifically. Offered without the careful management of everything else he showed the world. Then they put him in the vehicle, and the door closed. They gave her back her badge 6 weeks later. The ceremony was small and official, and her captain's desk had been cleaned out, and the precinct felt like a building that had exhaled. The FBI case moved fast once the ledger was in evidence. It turned out that physical records of 23 months of cartel police coordination were, as a prosecutor later described it, catastrophically comprehensive. Salazar was indicted within the month. 12 officers were suspended, pending investigation. Her name was formally cleared, then formally commended, in language that was appropriately bureaucratic and completely inadequate. She put her badge back on and felt its weight the way she'd felt it the first time, not as an institution's endorsement, but as a thing she'd decided to mean something, personally, regardless of what the institution did with it. She visited the attorney's office once. Not Chu's attorney, a different one, a contact, someone with no official connection to anything. She sat in a clean office and was told, without any names being used, that a particular legal situation was proceeding with considerable confidence, that the charges, while serious, faced significant evidentiary challenges, and that a resolution was anticipated within 12 to 18 months. 12 to 18 months. She drove home through a city that looked the same as it always had, and was not remotely the same city she'd understood it to be. 8 weeks ago. She parked. She sat in her car for a moment, in the particular quiet of an ending that isn't quite an ending. On her passenger seat, she'd placed the wanted poster, the original one, folded once along its center crease, logged during her arrest processing as a suspicious document, photographed, catalogued, and assigned an evidence number. Because that is what institutions do with things they don't understand. Evidence from a cleared case is eventually returned, and she had made sure she was the one to collect it. She picked it up. His face looked back at her from the slightly blurred photocopy. The steady, direct eyes, the jaw, the expression of a man being assessed by a camera and finding the whole exercise mildly interesting. She folded it carefully, put it in her jacket pocket, and went inside. She was, by every official account, a decorated hero. She was also a woman counting down 12 to 18 months with the particular patience of someone who has learned, from a very specific teacher, that the most important things are worth waiting for. Can Chu Hyun protect Hannah from behind bars? And what has he already set in motion that she doesn't know about yet? Smash that subscribe button and turn on notifications because you are not ready for what's coming next. This story is about to get so much darker. Drop a comment. Do you think their love can survive what's waiting on the other side of those prison doors? Like this video, if you're obsessed with this dangerous, impossible romance. The next chapter drops soon. Trust me, Hannah thinks the war is over. She's wrong.